Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to this evening's seminar. I've been running for about 5 years now a seminar called History of the Present. And the idea is to bring historians along to talk about the present and how the past has influenced the present and the interplay between present and the past. And we've had some great speakers come over time, but in recent years, I've actually chosen one or two broader topics, not so much political. And then I thought, well, I, I noticed that the United States has a controversial president, and I'm sure one or two of the rest of you have noticed this as well. So I thought, well, history of the present. Let's try and look at President Trump in historical context. And it was really, really easy to decide who to invite on this subject because our speaker tonight is David Milne. He's a professor of modern history at East Anglia University in the beautiful market town of Norwich in England. He graduated from the London School of Economics and Political Science with a BA in history in 1998. Subsequently did a master's degree there and then did his PhD at Cambridge University. I mean, I'm not going to begin to list all the publications that he has. His first book was America's Rasputin, Walt Rostow and the Vietnam War. And he followed that up with a book called World Making, The Art and Science of American Diplomacy, which was published in 2015 by FSG, Forest Strauss Giroux. And he's currently writing a book on a biography of the trailblazing Chicago Tribune journalist Sigrid Schultz, whom Hermann Göring denounces that dragon lady from Chicago. This sounds really interesting. I'm looking forward to it. And that book, Witness to Catastrophe, A Life of Sigrid Schultz, is under contract with Oxford University Press. So we have somebody who is a genuine expert on the history of the United States. We have a president who is unorthodox, striving for the right euphemisms here. And we're going to see what history makes of President Trump. David, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. It's a pleasure to be here at Science Europe. I'm grateful to Mark for the invitation and also to Dia De Furia for all her help with the logistics. Mark asked that I prepare something that places Donald Trump in historical perspective, and I can understand why. While the end of the Cold War encouraged a wave of future-oriented thinking, encompassing influential essays and books by Francis Fukuyama, Samuel Huntington, and Ken Jowett, Trump's political ascendancy has provoked dark reflections on the past. Ever since June 2015, when he descended into Trump Tower's lobby on his golden escalator and announced he was running for president, pundits and politicians have sought to make sense of Trump by comparing him to historical figures from the recent and distant past. And you'll be familiar with some of the names that have been invoked. Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, Mao Zedong, Julius Caesar, William Randolph Hearst, Henry Ford, Charles Lindbergh, and so on and so forth. There's so many more names that have been deployed, and we might come to these a little bit later on. So when I first thought about the lecture and planning it, I figured I would pop all these names into a hat, give them a little swirl, consider their accuracy, dismiss the ones that don't work, then pull out the name with all the limited authority vested in me as a historian that best matched Donald Trump and his peculiar psychology. But I realized quickly that that might be reductive, maybe even a little boring. So I'm going to try something a little different. So this lecture is not going to focus on the accuracy of these historical analogies. Instead, I'll consider what the comparisons reveal about the individuals and about the political groups making them. For Donald Trump is a Rorschach test, a bright orange ink blot. What people see in the ink pattern usually reveals more about them, in particular the way that these individuals and groups deny responsibility in facilitating his rise than it does about Trump. So before I begin, I'd like to issue a few caveats or health warnings. First, I'm a historian, not a political scientist, and all this talk of the present is going to make me slightly uncomfortable. I'm sure if my face changes color at any point or I start coughing nervously, it's simply because my historian self is protesting the presentism that's demanded of this lecture. But also, if at any point I sound like I'm an admirer of Donald Trump's politics, please assume that something has gone wrong in the manner of my communication. My jaw has hit the floor throughout the first and second Trump presidencies, just as regularly as his fiercest critics, whether they're never Trumpers, whether they're Democrats. But I do have issues with the way that Trump has been historicized up to this point. And this is an area, I think, where important scholarly work remains to be done. So Trump derangement syndrome, a phrase that you'll be familiar with, is usually characterized as a form of liberal hysteria in which individuals abandon their critical faculties in a visceral effort to place Trump beyond the pale, as uniquely dangerous, entirely without merit, as someone outside the American political tradition. But it was Republicans in 2015 and 2016 reeling from Trump's swift ascendancy. The BBC's Anthony Zurcher melodramatically reported that Trump had, quote, built a throne of skulls out of his Republican primary opponents, which is evocative, who launched the first wave of attacks on Trump. So during a tour promoting his book Hillbilly Elegy, J.D. Vance described himself as a never Trump guy. He wrote an op-ed in the New York Times titled, "Mr. Trump is unfit for our nation's highest office," and suggested that Trump might be America's Hitler in a text exchange with a friend. The Republican strategist David Frum, who coined George W. Bush's key foreign policy term, the axis of evil, suggested that Donald Trump is, quote, God's judgment on the United States for not being good enough citizens, end quote. Karl Rove, architect of George W. Bush's election victories in 2000, 2004, described Trump as, quote, a complete idiot and graceless and divisive. After some Republicans began to sense the direction of travel and switched their allegiance to Trump, the neoconservative William Kristol tweeted, quote, "What's depressing is how many conservatives are behaving like Austria," end quote. In reaching for European interwar fascism, Trump's Republican critics were attempting to other him and place him outside the mainstream of American political history. But in so doing, they were demonstrating a lack of attention to the nativism, to the paranoid style of American politics that situates Trump squarely in its arc. The name-calling was cathartic, but it probably also helped certain individuals absolve themselves of responsibility. And I'd like to accord Republicans who dislike Trump a bit more responsibility in making Trump possible. I'll be doing the same for Democrats a little bit later on, so please do hold on for that. I like to think this is a lecture that's going to kind of annoy everyone across the political spectrum. So it was the historian Richard Hofstadter. Exactly. It was the historian Richard Hofstadter who coined the phrase paranoid style in an influential essay for Harper's Magazine in 1964. Responding to the right-wing Republican Barry Goldwater's presidential campaign, Hofstadter described American politics as, quote, an arena for angry minds, noting how much political leverage can be got out of the animosities and passions of a small minority. So far, so relevant. But it wasn't simply anger that Goldwater was leveraging for votes. Behind this, wrote Hofstadter, I believe there's a style of mind that's far from new, and it's not necessarily right-wing. I call it the paranoid style simply because no other word adequately evokes the sense of heated exaggeration, suspiciousness, and conspiratorial fantasy that I have in mind, end quote. It's important, I think, that many of Trump's fiercest Republican critics had shaped and or gained from dark conspiratorial politics in winning elections. Richard Nixon's Southern Strategy election campaign of 1968, with his emphasis on law and order, fed white Southern paranoia about encroaching African-American political power that Lyndon Johnson's Voting and Civil Rights Acts had energized. Nixon directed his campaign at the silent majority of Americans who felt that Democrats had upended tradition and political precedent to advance corrosive liberal causes. The relatively genteel presidency of George H.W. Bush deployed one of the most notorious race-baiting advertisements in US political history, the Willie Horton campaign, that was electorally devastating for his opponent, Michael Dukakis. One strategist, Lee Atwater, was behind both these campaigns that preyed on people's worst instincts on race. When we think of historical precedents, indeed, Atwater is someone who really does, I think, help us understand Trump and the buttons that Trump pushes to help secure electoral success. But moving along to the George W. Bush presidency, in the 2002 midterm elections, the Republican candidate, Saxby Chambliss, defeated the Democratic senator for Georgia, Max Cleland, in a particularly shameless campaign. Cleland was a Vietnam veteran who had lost 3 limbs fighting for his country. Chambliss ran advertisements that paired Cleland with Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein, suggesting that all 3 wished to have America diminished, that Cleland, in other words, did not love his country. The presidential election of 2004, pitting George W. Bush against John Kerry, was, I think, at least as toxic as 2016 and 2024. Karl Rove weaponized the war on terror to cast aspersions on the Democratic Party's love of country. The Purple Heart recipient, John Kerry, was portrayed as a coward by the 527 political action group, Swift Boat Veterans for Truth. When it comes to deploying toxic political strategy in the paranoid style, then Republicans have reaped what they've sowed in many respects with Donald Trump. To the surprise of many, in an interview with CNN's Dana Bush a fortnight ago, the Republican Congresswoman from Georgia, Marjorie Taylor Greene, expressed regret for her role in demeaning US politics. Quote, "I'm sorry for taking part in the toxic politics. Put down the knives, be kind to one another. I never wanted to cause any harm," end quote. Of course, Greene's apology was shaped by the threats that she had received from MAGA world after Trump accused her of being a traitor and a lunatic for seeking full release of the Jeffrey Epstein files. Being on the receiving end of her own brand of politics was clearly an unsettling experience for Greene. Beyond the deft ways that Trump has weaponized toxicity, he practices insult politics better than just about anyone else. Trump's rise has been explained through the ascent of neoliberalism and the wealth inequality that's created. The story economist Thomas Piketty charts so effectively in Capital in the 21st Century, a book that's admittedly more owned than read, I think, due to its length, but certainly influential. And I think it explains a lot about where we are today. 30 years of tax cuts for the wealthy, the offshoring of American jobs that accompanied NAFTA and other free trade agreements, the dominance of neoliberalism in general, cratered the Rust Belt states that shifted critically for Trump in 2016, but it also instilled fears amongst middle-income Americans that their position was going to be further diminished. But foreign policy also figured in the 2016 GOP primaries and the election tussle with Hillary Clinton that followed. Trump's America First played well against the forever war that Trump's Republican critics and indeed Clinton and mainstream Democrats had placed at the heart of US foreign policy. Among other things, Trump's primary victory was a strong repudiation of the modern Republican Party's neoconservative influenced interventionism that reached its apogee during George W. Bush's first term, as well as its free trade instincts. But in invoking the darkest historical parallels, Republicans like Froome, William Kristol, Bret Stephens, Max Boot, Mitt Romney, and others were also cupping their ears with their hands and shouting to drown out the din. The course and consequences of the 2003 invasion of Iraq played a big role in making Trump possible, and too few Republicans, and some Democrats for that matter, have accepted blame for unleashing that catastrophe. I'm going to return to this a bit later. So what of the Democratic Party? Where do they reach when locating comparisons for Trump? I think a generalization holds true. Those on the left tend to see Trump as following a dark continuum in American history that leans on nativism and racism. So Charles Lindbergh and the Detroit demagogue and radio priest, Father Charles Coughlin, and others are appropriate analogues. Those in the mainstream of the party, though, are just as prone to invoke interwar fascism as the never-Trumpers and that dwindling band of what used to be known as the Republican Party's mainstream. So Hillary Clinton's book, What Happened, published the year after her electoral defeat, is remarkable for the number of pages spent ignoring the book's title, which really needed a question mark rather than a colon at the end. The what in Clinton's title were James Comey and Vladimir Putin. I wasn't just running against Donald Trump, I was up against the Russian intelligence apparatus, a misguided FBI director, and that godforsaken electoral college, wrote Clinton. And she's not entirely wrong. But the notion that Clinton's politics and those of the Democratic Party had failed provokes scarcely a flicker of recognition, let alone regret. Maybe it was too soon, for Hillary Clinton to really dwell on some of these deeper roots of what happened. In What Happened, Clinton writes approvingly of the historian Timothy Snyder, who has spent much of the last decade making the case that Trump is a proto-Hitler, flagging indicators of incipient fascism that the American people should identify and resist. There's likely a curious solace to be found in books that encourage readers to be proactive in resisting a looming fascist threat. His books on tyranny, The Road to Unfreedom, and On Freedom sit as squarely in the self-help category as they do in history. It's also comforting, perhaps, to think of Trump as a monster who can only be understood when compared with some of the worst non-American villains from history. And of course, it's worth noting that fascist inspiration ran both ways across the Atlantic. So in seeking ideas for race laws to exclude Jews, prominent Nazis turned to the United States' segregationist race laws as a precedent to emulate. It's a fascinating dynamic that James Whitman explores in his 2017 book, Hitler's American Model. But to turn back to Snyder, are his fears well-founded? Is Trump a fascist or a looming fascist? So here comes my personal view. Trump obviously has clear authoritarian tendencies. I mean, that's without any doubt. He's proven himself capable of remarkable personal cruelty, is profoundly narcissistic and thin-skinned, and will stifle dissent to the very, very best of his ability. As the various lawsuits he's issued and the curious case of Jimmy Kimmel has recently suggested. He's damaged the US and its reputation internationally, his promises to deploy force against domestic opponents, the expansion of ICE, the threats to deploy the National Guard against restive democratic cities are hugely concerning for all the reasons that I'm sure you'll understand and relate to. But January 6th was not a serious attempt at a coup d'etat. Trump's foreign policy in general favors retrenchment, not expansion, with some limited exceptions to that rule. Trump has zero interest in the notion of sacrifice for one's country. In refusing to visit a war cemetery in Normandy in 2020, Trump observed that American soldiers who died for their country were losers and suckers. Of course, Trump's famous bone spurs meant he was able to avoid active military service. Compare that to the Nazi cult around martyrs like Horst Wessel, the suicide cult that became Hitler's Berlin bunker as the Red Army approached. As historian Richard Evans wrote in The New Statesman in 2021, quote, the majority of genuine specialists, and this is a dig at Timothy Snyder, who Richard Evans has had a long history with, I think it's fair to say. The majority of genuine specialists, including the historians Roger Griffin, Matthew Feldman, Stanley Payne, Ruth Ben Guyot, agree that whatever else he is, Trump is not a fascist, end quote. What Donald Trump is, first and foremost, is a damning indictment of US political culture. The Republican Party of the last 30 years has moved towards ever greater ideological uniformity on the right. Its politics have narrowed, and its electoral tactics have increasingly relied on sowing division, often on the basis of race, but also on patriotism and what it means to put America first. Some of you will know Thomas Mann and Norm Ornstein, co-authors of many studies of US politics, and particularly of Congress. Mann is based at the Brookings Institution, and Ornstein at the American Enterprise Institute. Their bipartisanship alongside their scholarship made them really trusted commentators for a long period of time. In 2012, they published a book, It's Even Worse Than It Looks, that issued a clear statement of where blame should be accorded. And I'll just quote, it's quite a long quote, but I'll quote it. Today's Republican Party is an insurgent outlier. It's become ideologically extreme, contemptuous of the inherited social and economic policy regime, scornful of compromise, unpersuaded by conventional understanding of facts, evidence, and science, all but declaring war on the government. The Democratic Party, while no paragon of civic virtue, is more ideologically centered and diverse, protective of the government's role as it developed over the course of the last century, open to incremental change in policy fashioned through bargaining with the Republicans, and less disposed to or adept at take-no-prisoners conflict between the parties. This asymmetry between the parties, which journalists and scholars often brush aside as or whitewash in a quest for balance, constitutes a huge obstacle to effective government, end quote. This was published in 2012. This is the time of the Tea Party, the opposition to Obama. I agree with Mann and Ornstein that the Democratic Party accommodates more intellectual diversity, but in elevating the politics of identity and neglecting the politics of inequality, it has created sharp electoral problems for itself, just as the Labour Party has done in the United Kingdom and other parties have done elsewhere. There's a lot more to unpack here, and it'll be fun to discuss this in the Q&A, but I personally find the over-reliance on celebrity appearances, all multi-millionaires, during the latter stages of the Clinton and Harris campaigns suggestive of an absence of ideas. If we've got time later, I'll explain why I was a supporter from afar of Bernie Sanders' 2016 campaign, while I viewed Jeremy Corbyn as a disaster for the Labour Party. Honestly, hear me out on this. It makes sense. I'll stand by it. But yeah, it's a fascinating dynamic. In a sharply polarized political system with fewer and fewer swing voters, the person who secures the party nomination stands a strong chance of winning the election, regardless of their unfitness for office. And nearly all mainstream Democrats and Republicans agreed through the 2016 primaries that Trump was unfit for high office. On polarization, both political and in reference to the dire media landscape in the United States, I'd recommend Ezra Klein's 2020 book, Why We're Polarized. In addition to this, Roderick Hart's book, also published in 2020, Trump and Us, What He Says and Why People Listen, is excellent on the sources of Trump's appeal. One of my favorite lines from Hart's book is, quote, the reality is that more Americans speak like President Trump than speak like Jim Acosta, end quote. It's self-evident, I suppose, and it's true not of Jim Acosta, but many Democrats, Republicans, journalists, and so on and so forth. Trump sounds deeply weird to a particular milieu. I think we in that room are probably that milieu. To another swathe of the United States and perhaps even to the world, he's relatable, he's funny. And though he weaponizes division, paranoia, and hate, goodness does he use the word love frequently. When Trump addresses a supportive crowd, he expresses his love for them without qualms. Who can forget Trump's remark following his first election victory that, quote, we won with the highly educated, we won with the poorly educated. I love the poorly educated, end quote. He does. not least because he's poorly educated himself, albeit at the New York Military Academy and the University of Pennsylvania. But I also think that America's foreign policy failures need to be recognized and better understood by both parties. Ownership of responsibility is overdue. At the moment, I'm working as a historical consultant on a 6-part Radio 4 documentary that'll be presented by David Dimbleby. It focuses on the American century and some of the so-called hidden hands that have shaped it. The first episode will examine Harry Dexter White, the architect of the Bretton Woods Agreement that founded the IMF and the World Bank and established the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. The second episode explores the career of George Kennan. I was having a disagreement with the producer last week. I'm like, Kennan is not a hidden hand. We know about Kennan. And he said, well, actually, the commissioning editor of Radio 4 has never heard of George Kennan. So it works for us. So fine, a hidden hand. Anyway, Kennan, his notion of containing Soviet expansionism led to far-sighted policies such as the Marshall Plan and the creation of NATO. 1944 to 1950 represents the high point of US grand strategy. A rules-based international order was created, and innovations that advanced America's interests and those of Western Europe and Japan were introduced. As a political scientist, John Eikenberry writes in his book, Liberal Leviathan, in the decades after World War II, the US engaged in the most ambitious and far-reaching liberal order building the world had yet seen, end quote. Later episodes of this BBC documentary are going to focus on Allen Dulles and CIA interventionism and the ideas and policy advisors who pushed the US into a futile war in Vietnam. Then we'll chart the rise of neoconservatism, the 9/11 attacks, the global war on terror, the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and the terrible harvest that it has reaped. The darker side of America's leadership of this liberal international order sometimes gets minimized to an extent by its advocates. In a 2016 report for the RAND Corporation, and here I'm going to invoke a fellow historian based at SAIS, the historian Hal Brands wrote, quote, the promotion of democracy and globalization, the use of American force deployments and security guarantees to stabilize the international order, efforts to contain or undermine autocratic rogue states, these efforts have remained among the foremost components of America's post-Cold War grand strategy, end quote. And here, I think Brands is not necessarily wrong, but there is a rose tint, I think, that's present. Post-Cold War US foreign policy was too often susceptible to hubris, to overreach, and the architects of this policy, this foreign policy, particularly those who served in the presidency of George W. Bush, are often those who lambast Trump in the most vitriolic terms. But the advantages that accompany US leadership of the US liberal international order sometimes get stated too often rather than explained. To return to Brands' report for RAND, he writes, the liberal international order is, quote, now generally recognized as having been broadly effective in delivering a range of important benefits for the US. It's widely accepted that American engagement has helped deliver a prosperous and generally open international economy, and that this international economy has produced broad prosperity gains for the United States, even if those gains have been unevenly distributed. Again, I think Brands is broadly correct, but the line that he places in brackets, even if those gains have been unevenly distributed, is of course crucial. If you randomly picked an American voter and asked them to explain the liberal international order and why it was good for them, you'd almost certainly draw a blank. To be perfectly honest, I think the same would hold true for most undergraduate students. Clearly not master's students at Johns Hopkins Science Europe. But generally, it's not something that's well understood. Though I'm using them as foils to an extent, I agree largely with Eikenberry and Brands on the advantages of the system that came into view during the Roosevelt and Truman presidencies. But simply invoking the superiority of a liberal rules-based international order, a concept that's really challenging for the layperson to understand, is not enough. So a broader reckoning with US foreign policy failure is badly needed. Since the end of the Cold War, both parties committed to an increasingly interventionist foreign policy that led to missteps, most notably the 2003 invasion of Iraq, whose strategists lost sight of the limits of US power. This has alienated Americans who wonder energized by Trump's mantra, why they're not always put first. The same dynamic is, of course, present across Europe. Witness Viktor Orban, Marine Le Pen, Giorgia Meloni, Geert Wilders, etc. But in reference to the US, the more loudly Trump's critics cry Hitler, the more likely it is that a serious reckoning with those failures will not necessarily happen. I think historians might also have to consider whether the era of the rules-based international order, 1944 to 2016, Bretton Woods to Donald Trump, might not look anomalous when considering the longer arc of American history. Resisting entangling alliances, placing America first, enjoying the advantages that accompany what historian C. Van Woodward described as free security, weak neighbors to the north and south, vast oceans to the east and west, is as American as it gets. Trump's anti-immigrant policies, so integral to his electoral success, also have a long history. From the 1798 Enemy Aliens Act to the 1952 Immigration and Nationality Act, a legal framework was actually already there for Trump to declare war on immigration, or the immigration that he disapproved of. President Trump is so often portrayed as norm-shattering and un-American, but perhaps he's a reversion to longer-standing and distinctly American traditions that narrowly and crudely focus on what's good for the nation. While Donald Trump's authoritarian tendencies present various threats, and some of the fascist comparisons might be helpful in apprehending them, I do believe it's better to engage with his presidency as authentically American. To quote David Remnick, the editor of the New Yorker magazine, quote, "Trump is a distinctly local product, like the smell of a Times Square subway platform in mid-August," end quote. The more we understand Trump as a local product, and the more Republicans and Democrats assume a degree of responsibility in creating Trump and making him happen, the more likely it is that we will locate a politics that charts a constructive way forward for the United States and the world that it may still lead. Thank you.
Right, I'm not going to abuse my position as chair by asking the first question, as so many people do. I throw the floor open, please. Any questions with our speaker? Questions? Over here, Professor Radchenko. Please, when you give your name, just give your name as well, and any other affiliation you may care to give.
Thank you, David. Thank you for a fantastic lecture. I'll be the first one to while people are thinking of their questions, let me ask you a silly question. I mean, when people say that Trump is a fascist, that does strike me historically. Basically, you call anybody fascist. It's almost just a way of expressing one's disapprobation than really an analytical category. But what comes in into people's minds, do you think? Do you think it's Hitler? Do they compare? I mean, is that the type of fascism we're talking about? Because there are also other types. You could, look to this country. It has a history with fascism, so you could compare, Trump to Mussolini, for example, as counterproductive that may be. When people compare, when people say that Trump is a fascist and a Hitler, do they have a particular thing in mind, i.e., relating to Nazi Germany? And couldn't you say, well, fascism is a broad church, and you can accommodate all kinds of characters, including Mussolini, including Franco, including Trump?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's absolutely right. Although I do think that Hitler and the Nazis is the go-to that is provoked when Trump is a fascist comes to mind, partly because less is known, broadly speaking, about Italian fascism, in the United States and across the world, and about Franco's Spain, and so I think that's definitely the go-to. And I think in terms of the fear that, or the sense of looming danger that it instills, the Hitler analogy is the one that probably packs the greatest punch. I mean, I do think it's possible, and there are scholars that have been doing this, looking at varieties of fascism, looking at its various manifestations, seeking to determine which of them best sort of match or best suit Trump. And I must say, I did think initially, maybe I'll take that approach with the lecture, but I think it's the ferocity of some of the denunciations of Trump. While I can understand it, I do understand it, but I do think there's a degree of masking that kind of takes place there. And like last week, I was just saying to Mark earlier, I was covering the Dick Cheney funeral on BBC News. Immensely stressful, talking, essentially, or broadly speaking, I would say Dick Cheney's legacy is not one that I'm favorable towards. And I'm watching, the events from Washington, speaking, being asked about Cheney's most significant legacy. And he was the most powerful vice president in US history, but it's equally that he was an architect of the invasion of Iraq. And also, he represented a form of partisanship, a sort of a brutality in some ways of a politics that really, I think, was there and present in 2004 in that campaign against John Kerry. I think also through the Obama presidency, Cheney was, George W. Bush didn't say anything. Cheney went after Obama, describing him as the worst president in US history. And, I think there's a type of Republican who attacks Trump in fairly vitriolic terms, but I think oftentimes there's not any real reflection on what's made Trump possible. And I think the modern Republican Party probably deserves the largest portion of that blame in so doing. But in terms of the fascist analogies, I think it's Hitler essentially, that the US public certainly, in reading a Timothy Snyder book, that's what they're reading, that's what they're reaching for.
Anybody else? Comments? Very quiet tonight. Let me ask you one. Explain to me why Bernie Sanders was great and Jeremy Corbyn was a disaster.
So
I've got lots of questions.
So my view on this is that Bernie Sanders, if he was in British politics, he'd be slap in the middle of the Labour Party. Maybe it could even be a Lib Dem in terms of, the causes that Bernie Sanders was advocating, a greater degree of redistribution, socialized medicine. This is all stuff that we take for granted in the UK, right? This is mainstream politics. So his domestic politics never sounded particularly radical to me, Bernie Sanders. And I think his views on foreign policy, by and large, I didn't have any real problem with those either. So I've chatted to lots of people, particularly US colleagues who are, on the left and are big supporters of Jeremy Corbyn. I'm like, no, Corbyn's instincts on foreign policy, I think, were kind of catastrophic. After the Salisbury poisoning, that response, we should see what Putin has to say on this. He worries me significantly. Whereas I think Sanders, I think it's partly about his politics. And also I think Trump's politics captured what was necessary or represented what was necessary for Democrats, I think, in 2015, 2016, more than Hillary Clinton's did. And so, again, that's why I viewed Sanders at that time, anyway, as someone who's better equipped to deal with the type of appeal that Trump would exert.
Okay. Let me just follow up on that. And this is something that I was actually downloaded and your talk before the lecture. Don't you think you're letting the Democrats off a bit light? And the reason I ask that is, isn't there just a touch of we are the enlightened ones who are supposed to lead? And these American masses have thrown up this, they've thrown up this roughneck, this developer who's got no education, and now he's leading. No, he's taking the place that we should be doing. Don't you think there's a big element of that?
Oh, completely. I think that's absolutely the case, and maybe we should develop it a little bit more. But I feel like in talking about the sort of the reliance on celebrity politics, the absence of ideas, I think in the mainstream Democratic Party, I kind of probably needed to devote a bit more attention to that. But I completely agree with you. James Carville, you might have just seen a day or two ago. So James Carville was Bill Clinton's principal kind of electoral strategist, associated with a kind of a centrism, a third way type of democratic politics. And he wrote an op-ed in the New York Times basically saying, now is the time for economic populism on the Democratic Party. We need to redistribute. We need to pursue radical policies. Kind of the stuff that Sanders was saying in 2015 and 2016. So, I take that as encouraging, I think, to an extent. that Carville is coming up with something like that. But yeah, I would place the blame. I mean, also in regards to foreign policy missteps. I mean, the invasion of Iraq in 2003, many Democrats supported that. And not only that, if you look at the course of post-Cold War US foreign policy, it was Democrats who were more interventionist oftentimes than Republicans. And John F. Kennedy's inaugural address, you know, paying any price and bearing any burden to assure the success of liberty, was incredibly eloquent, but you could argue that this helped create a momentum for intervention in the Vietnam War, which was one of the most catastrophic mistakes. So I think, absolutely, I take your point. I think Democrats deserve blame in all the ways that you've indicated.
Oh, please, yes. Gentleman over here.
Thank you, Professor. My name is Jason Guth. I'm a first-year IA student here. Do you think that, so you mentioned that kind of Trump represents kind of a historical, either link to nativism or kind of it's not that, his policies aren't that inordinate in terms of American context. Do you think it's because he's basically the only one who's gotten this far? So you have people like Huey Long in the early 20th century, or John Reed, rather, the founder of the Communist Party. So that it's not kind of, as you said, kind of unique, and it's just he got this far and Huey Long was assassinated, or John Reed died of typhus, for example, and then that's why it's such a stark contrast.
Yeah, I mean, in the sense,
Can I just, sorry, I don't mean to be rude, but abusing my position of chair, because since we're picking up on comparisons and lots of, Barry Goldwater surely is the best comparison, or not?
yeah, I mean, absolutely. Goldwater, I mean, I mentioned Goldwater in the context of the toxicity of his campaign. I mean, obviously, Goldwater in some respects was like ahead of his time in that the politics that he represented and advanced really took off in the 70s and 80s, and Reagan's ascendancy was really shaped in many ways by some of the precedents set by Goldwater. But in terms of the nativism, and as you know, the history of the United States is a story of immigration, but it's also a story of backlash, and it's a story of, yeah, you mentioned Huey Long, you mentioned others. It's one of decrying the sort of toxic effects of certain immigrant groups, whether they be from Southern and Eastern Europe or whether they be Irish immigrants. I mean, looking at different points in history. So Trump is clearly operating on a continuum there. Particularly, you know, how Trump distinguishes, I kind of alluded to this, the kind of the good immigrants that we want and the kinds that we don't want. So I think it was in his first term, he was like, why are we not getting more Norwegians coming to the United States? This was, I think, the direct example that he employed. Like, Norway is a very successful kind of country. Maybe they don't necessarily want to flood to the, you know, there's a lot to unpack there. But yeah, I think there's absolutely a tradition. And I think it's obviously one that Trump has, you know, he's risen to the, you know, to the very top, advancing that type of politics. But I think it sits at a particular moment in history where the hastening of wealth inequality, the sense of being left behind, the sense that immigrant groups in the United States are succeeding in a way that undermines the position of a certain white electorate, I suppose. Barack Obama's presidency was clearly hugely triggering in that sense, and that helps explain, I think, the rise of the Tea Party, but also some of the vitriol that kind of followed in its wake. So the gist of your point, I think, is absolutely right.
Over here.
Thank you for your talk. I am Marco. I just have a quick question. You alluded to the paradigm, you know, of politics of identity versus politics of inequality briefly, and I wanted you to expand on that. Can you elaborate? What does this suggest about political attitudes and behavior in America? And more specifically, how does this explain or situate Trump in a historical context, or does it at all? Thanks.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so I think it's fair to say over the last 20 years, and this is something that James Carville also points out and alludes to in this op-ed, terms like Latinx, issues pertaining to gender identity, defund the police in the aftermath of the Black Lives Matter movement, all of which clearly, important in all different kinds of respects, but these are not issues that a substantial chunk of the US electorate actually care about. And I think in focusing on these issues that pertain to certain forms of identity, this has had an impact in terms of losing a particular voting bloc that might have previously voted for a party of the left on the basis of inequality or redistribution, but they find it hard to relate to certain elements of this politics that sounds kind of so alien to them. So I think that's what I'm kind of driving at, and I think that's probably what James Carville's driving at this in this op-ed as well.
Anybody else?
Hi there. My name is Joe Pessman. Thanks so much again for your talk. I wanted to ask, I'm always thrilled to criticize my country's Democratic Party, especially when they're not being supportive of labor and equality. But we've also seen this type of populist resurgence in a lot of other countries, including in Europe, France, and other countries that have a much stronger welfare system, much greater redistributive economic policies than we've seen in the United States. So would your argument be that the United States would have had to go even further to the left of some of these countries in correcting this problem, or that the problem lies somewhere else?
Yeah, so to compare so I mentioned in the lecture, the likes of Viktor Orban and Milne and others, the sources of their political success, the explanations that speak to the sources of their appeal, there are absolutely some overlap with those of the United States. But I think US politics, it sits so far apart in terms of the median point on so many issues of domestic politics. And I think in Europe anyway, across these European parties, I mean, immigration is clearly something that's been sort of instrumental in the rise of these, and again, thinking of the UK. I gave a talk. It was on Obama's foreign policy legacy in 2016 in New York at Council on Foreign Relations, and there was a question that was kind of like, well, it was more or less, Barack Obama's clearly dropped the ball when it comes to Brexit. I think that was kind of the premise of the question. That in some ways, Obama's line that the UK were going to be at the back of the queue in the event of Brexit happening, in regards to his lack of attention to sort of UK, the special relationship or whatever, as if this had the first thing to do with Brexit, which stemmed from a number of sources, including wealth inequality, but also immigration, particularly from ascension countries in Eastern Europe. So I completely agree with you that it's hard to map European populism directly onto US politics because they're very, very different median points. But I do think in respect to the type of politics that the Democratic Party might successfully leverage, this explains perhaps some of the support I was expressing for Bernie Sanders. And I found it remarkable in the various stints that I've spent in the US. The healthcare system, even though I had pretty good healthcare when I was at Yale on a fellowship, I was shocked by how much extra I had to pay. There's a cost of living crisis clearly in the United States at the moment, as there is in other nations. But Mark and I were just discussing this previously. It's not just blue collar workers in Rust Belt states that are struggling. It's it's middle income Americans as well. So, I mean, maybe the time for you. I mean, this is not going to happen in the US, but universal basic income. Some of these more radical kind of suggestions, maybe finding an opportune time to land. This is not so much in the US as piles. But yeah, I do like recognize the premise of your question. Agree with it.
Anybody else? Yeah, please. Alexa.
My name's Alexa, and I have a question about, I guess, the uniqueness of this moment of political polarization. I have been struck by Ezra Klein's comments actually since the publication of his, in which it's talked about kind of what he sees as this new normalization and perhaps also glorification of political violence that was present in the 60s, but has really taken on, has expanded and evolved in the current political moment. And specifically, he was talking about this in the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's shooting, but just the wave of political violence we've seen, obviously President Trump's comments as well. And so I'm curious, considering this moment we're in, but also the 60s and other kind of explosions of violence that we've seen in the past throughout American history, how much do you think what we're witnessing today is kind of another iteration of this pattern of reactionaryism in America's past, and how much of it is a new critical turning point?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question. You mentioned the 1960s, and obviously there's a very, very long history of political violence in the United States, as there is in lots of other nations. The assassination, of William McKinley, being a sort of good example of that. There are plenty others beside, and I think that it's maybe interesting. I mean, the case of Marjorie Taylor Greene is fascinating because I guess her name was made on a fairly kind of dark conspiratorial sense of, there's pedophile rings in Washington, D.C., and this is the restaurant where it all, I mean, this was fairly extreme stuff. And you can imagine the type of potential violence that rhetoric like that might encourage. And I think the recent example that she's had of calling out Trump on the Epstein files, Trump describing her in, fairly vitriolic terms, and the fear that that's instilled in her, it's been fascinating to chart her reaction to that. I mean, in terms of where the United States stands currently and how it compares to moments in the past, clearly, 1968 with the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, and this dire sequence of political violence that was present, you're absolutely seeing kind of echoes of that. But then you come into the history of gun violence in the United States, and that's a kind of a larger story that probably I don't have time to sort of delve into. But your basic point, that there's a longer history that's present, I absolutely accept that.
Please. Please introduce yourself.
Yeah. My name is Giovanni Casapelli. I'm American Italian.
Ah.
Pay taxes in the United States. And
Better than paying them in Italy.
I was fascinated by your presentation, the way you explained us where US politics was coming from. But I'm asking myself, where is US politics going under Donald Trump? I have been listening to his last 10 speeches, trying to figure out where does his mind belong, what kind of, and I don't find any coherence. I don't think he's well.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think he's well because you may have heard some of the speeches.
Mm.
Where do you put him within your framework of theories, of attitudes? Because, frankly speaking, I don't think it makes any sense.
Yeah. I think part of the reason why it doesn't make any sense, and I think, you're onto something in terms of the variation in how he interacts with people. So that, the recently elected mayor of New York City, Mayor Mamdani, that was a meeting that went extremely well, much to the surprise of everyone, including Trump's supporters, who were appalled, that Trump is saying nice things about the so-called Marxist. Yeah, communist, exactly. And so I think Trump he relies so heavily on personal interaction and his instincts. And you're going back to his first term and his the attacks on Kim Jong-un, the Rocket Man stuff, and then Trump has this notion, well, actually, I'll be able to go and meet him, and he starts praising him. it's kind of wild, but it's based very much on the whims of Trump, the individual, and how he perceives chemistry, almost. So it's a very kind of personalized form of politics in terms of interactions with other foreign policy leaders. I think that does defy categorization and does lead to individuals thinking about what's the grand strategy, what is the US grand strategy at the moment, to kind of tear their hair out, because there is so much of the personal, in the political. And the negotiations between Trump and Xi Jinping, Trump's like, yeah, it's 12 out of 10. This is great. It's all going fantastically. And then Jinping says, well, in a very careful and measured way, well, there's a long way to go. We need to think about the medium. It's like he's speaking like someone who is in charge of a nation that has a longer term strategy thinking forward, whereas there's a degree of convulsiveness when it comes to Trump and his personal relations. So yeah, I completely take your point. It makes him quite confounding, really, in all kinds of ways. But as a historian writing on the history of US foreign policy, I came up with this, I thought, this very kind of careful, maybe semi-thoughtful thesis about using art and science as a binary to help explain the drivers of US foreign policy from the late 19th century to the present. The present, as I wrote it, was the Obama administration. And then Trump was elected, and I was like, what do I do now? What do I say now? It's hard. And I think it's hard as well because so many of the think tanks and so many of those individuals who write on foreign policy and seek to influence it and to access the revolving door between academia and government that's kind of dried up. By and large, there are some individuals who, of course, served in the Trump administration, but those individuals tended not to have a great time. H.R. McMaster would be a good example to draw there. But I think in regards to the wild sort of variety in Trump, I think that's explained by the way that he personalizes politics and the way that he ascertains or decides if someone's a good guy. I mean, almost by the extent that that person smiles or shows a degree of appreciation for him. So yeah, really hard. And when it comes to models, that's why I'm glad I'm a historian, not a political scientist. I don't have to worry about trying to formulate one.
If you look at past history, among the Roman emperors, there are a couple of them that remind me of Donald Trump.
Yeah. That's right.
Caligula is
yes. Yeah, Caligula's been invoked. Absolutely. Yeah.
At the back, sir. At the back, please. Can't see you exactly, but give us some background.
Okay. Yes, my name is Iliake, and I'm a first year MAIR student. It might be a dumb question, but in 2008, President Obama was elected, right? And at that time, the Democrat had a super majority in the both House and the Senate, maybe 67 seats in the Senate or something. So I guess my question is, how was he able to elect it in the first place? Because I kind of wonder that, in this political climate, I don't think he will be able to win places like Iowa or a Midwest. And another question is that, do you think something like that will ever happen again? Despite the fact that now it's so polarized and it's either every 4 year, Democrats, Republican, do you ever see that Democrat would to get the super majority in the future?
Yeah. So to the second part of the question, demographics are probably that is what should give perhaps the Democratic Party the greatest faith that in the future their brand of politics, which appeals to a wider constituency in many respects, is going to prevail. On Obama's political appeal, I mean, I think we need to remember as well that Obama was a remarkably gifted political orator. He was someone who could inspire. He was someone who energized the base. He was someone who spoke in moderated, nuanced terms about the arc of US history. He had a peculiar combination of attributes that made him, you know, an incredibly impressive candidate. And I think that one of the points that Hillary Clinton makes in her book, and other observers have noted as well, is when it comes, of course, to the electoral college, you know, which is essentially preventing Democrats from allowing their plurality in the popular vote to translate into victories in presidential elections. But when you think of Obama and the places that he won, he did actually win in the places that you've mentioned, many of the sort of the Midwestern states. I mean, obviously, he was running at the time of the global financial crisis of 2008. And John McCain, for all his strengths as a candidate, he wasn't particularly compelling in responding to some of the questions on economics and what had gone wrong. But then there's also the point as well that I talked about the invasion of Iraq and the aftermath. Dick Cheney famously said deficits don't matter. And the US by 2008 was in an incredibly parlous financial situation, just like it was at the end of the Reagan administration, which led to George H.W. Bush rescinding his pledge not to raise taxes. So there's a lot of things that kind of came together, which explained Barack Obama's electoral victory. But also, I mean, Trump's victory against Hillary Clinton, well, what did it rest on? About 40 or 50,000 voters across critical swing states. I mean, these margins are very, very small. The margins are so small that I can kind of understand Hillary Clinton's instinct to say, well, it's not about my politics. It's about Putin, dirty tricks, James Comey. It's someone else's kind of problem. But do I think that an Obama type figure is possible? Of course, I absolutely think that. And I think that you know, Obama's attributes were significant in all different kinds of ways. Yeah. Thanks.
Anybody else? Well, I've got one last question then, if I may. Aren't we fighting history wars here? To come back to the reason why I run this seminar, that the United States doesn't have any longer, if ever it did have, but my feeling is any longer, a shared sense of its history. I mean, there was always a somewhat benign interpretation of American history, which managed to put slavery in brackets. But now you have extraordinarily polarized historical narratives, which is one of the reasons why you just simply, and you get the culture wars in university, because people simply cannot agree on rules of engagement. How much is history and the history that the historical narratives that people carry in their heads responsible for the polarization of politics?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's there. I mean, I think I would say, first of all, as well, that Donald Trump is probably he is the least historically informed president in US history. He doesn't really reach for history and precedent. And when he uses a word that he likes and it provokes well, maybe you shouldn't use that because of what happened in the 20s or 30s. He's like, no, I'm using it in a completely different way. He doesn't necessarily get the historical resonance, I think, or doesn't care about the historical resonance of terms that he uses. I do think that, like the 1619 Project, for example, at the New York Times, that has absolutely been weaponized and deployed as a sign that liberals don't get it. We're all about self-flagellation. There's a wider history of US success and progress and so on, that simply explaining everything through the prism of slavery and race kind of neglects. And I think perhaps Trump has weaponized that effectively. But I also think, in addition to history and these two different narratives that are emerging, I feel the media landscape in the US encourages this, obviously. I used to always say that the BBC was, generally speaking, a force for some kind of moderation in the UK, in the sense that this is a single source. I know it's controversial, and definitely Nigel Farage is no fan of the BBC, but it's a single point of reference that I think a lot of people, Labour or Conservative, draw to. The fact that the US, people are just in their echo chambers, consuming the media that repeats back to them what they want to hear, is creating a rigidity and contributes to the polarization. But I think history, it's always, I mean, as you know, it's always contested.
But that's really why I asked, because you said during your lecture that you are yourself collaborating and working on the creation of a documentary on the history of the United States in the 20th century. Do you think the United States are going to treat this as, how's it going to be, what's the reception going to be? Are you going to be treated, oh, these foreigners don't understand anything? Or are you going to get this as a liberal plot from overseas? Are you going to get, I mean, do you see my point?
Yeah, I do.
How is it possible to do that kind of project and then sell it to Americans in this current context?
Fortunately, that's not for me.
It's not your job.
It's for the producer to do. And I think, I mean, obviously a Radio 4 documentary will have a largely kind of UK audience. It'd be wonderful if on the BBC Sounds app, it gets an audience in the US. I mean, I think in terms of how we're trying to fashion it, and in particularly focusing on presidencies, both Republican and Democrat, where serious missteps have happened, as well as far-sighted policies. I hope there's a degree of sort of even-handedness there, but I also know that the BBC is not an institution in certain circles in the United States that carries the gravitas and weight that it once did. I mean, even Joe Biden, you remember, a reporter from the BBC went up to him and said, "Oh, I'm ex from the BBC," and Joe Biden says, "Oh, I'm Irish. I'm not speaking to you." It was a really funny reaction from Biden at the time. Curious in lots of ways, but I think Trump's, obviously the legal action against the BBC, again, fascinating I mean, also BBC did drop the ball. I mean, that Panorama documentary, the editing that happened, it should never have happened. And, they should own that. The presenter of this thing I'm working on, David Dimbleby's come out and said, it shouldn't have happened. And maybe the authority of a David Dimbleby will help. Who knows?
David Dimbleby, I should explain, is like Tom Brokaw used to be in the United States. He's a very well-known figure.
Yeah. It's not me saying these things. It's David Dimbleby. So maybe that'll help. Yeah.
Well, I think we can all say thank you to David. Thank you very much. Ooh.
Sorry. I've just the questions on
Thank you for coming.